Nobody in Colby Creek expected Harriet Wallace to walk into the livestock competition registration booth, plunk down her 2 silver coins, and write her name on that weathered clipboard. But the moment she did, the entire course of her life changed in ways she never could have predicted, and certainly never could have planned for, especially not on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, when the dust was still rolling off the Kansas plains like it had somewhere important to be. Harriet was 31 years old, and she had the kind of face that made men think twice before being careless with their words around her. Not because she was frightening, though she could be when the situation called for it, but because there was a steadiness in her dark brown eyes that suggested she had already survived things that would have broken most people, and she had come out the other side not harder exactly, but more honestly herself. Her dark hair had a single streak of silver near her left temple that had appeared 3 winters ago, 2 months after they buried her husband Robert Wallace out on the far edge of the property, under the cottonwood tree he had always said he liked best. She never tried to hide it. She thought of it as a marking, like the rings inside an old tree, something that simply told the truth about the time that had passed. Robert had been a good man. Not a perfect man, not a romantic man in the way that the dime novels her sister sent from St. Louis described, but a steady and decent man who had worked alongside her every day for 7 years and built something real from the rocky, unyielding piece of land they had purchased together for $300 and a handshake agreement with old Amos Fetter, who had given up trying to farm it and gone back east to sell hardware. Robert and Harriet had coaxed that land into producing. They had raised hogs and chickens and eventually 2 cattle, then 4, then a small but respectable herd. They had built a second room onto the original 1-room house. They had been happy in the plain, workmanlike way that Harriet had come to understand was the real kind of happy, the kind that did not announce itself, but simply existed quietly alongside the daily business of living. Then the winter of 1879 had come in vicious and early, and Robert had gone out in a blinding ice storm to pull a calf that was refusing to be born at a reasonable hour, and he had slipped on the frozen creek bed and struck his head on a stone, and that had been that. Their son Eli, who had been 5 years old and more interested in the painted wooden horses his uncle had sent than in the reality of the situation, had not fully understood what it meant that his father was not coming to supper. Harriet had understood it precisely and completely, and she had sat with that understanding through the long night, and then risen the next morning and fed the animals and gone about the business of surviving because Eli needed her too, and because the land did not care about grief and demanded attendance regardless. 3 years on, she was managing. More than managing, if she was being honest with herself, which she generally tried to be. The herd had grown to 14 head. She had hired a part-time hand named Clem, a quiet boy of 17 who was handy with fences and did not try to tell her what she was doing wrong, which was more valuable than most people appreciated. Eli was 8 now and serious in the way that boys who have lost fathers early sometimes become serious, but he laughed easily when something genuinely struck him as funny, and he had a gift for understanding animals that Harriet recognized as something that could not be taught. The livestock competition was held every May in Colby Creek, which was a proper town by Kansas standards, with a main street that ran 5 blocks and had a hotel, 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a feed store, a church, a schoolhouse, and a telegraph office that had only been there since the previous autumn and was still regarded with a mixture of wonder and suspicion by the older residents. The competition drew ranchers and farmers from as far as 40 miles in every direction, and it was generally considered to be the social event of the season, combining as it did the serious business of judging cattle and horses and hogs with the social pleasures of a 3-day fair that included a pie contest, a fiddle competition, and in the evenings, dances at the hotel that went until midnight. Harriet had attended the competition every year since she and Robert had settled in Colby Creek, first as a spectator, then in the last 2 years of Robert's life as an entrant with a promising yearling bull that had taken second place both times, losing to Harvey Brooks's operation both times, a fact that Robert had accepted with good grace, but had mentioned rather more often than was perhaps strictly necessary in the months between competitions. She had not entered since Robert died. It had simply not occurred to her as something she would do alone, the same way certain other things had not occurred to her as things she would do alone, like sitting on the front porch after supper, or celebrating their wedding anniversary, or the various small rituals that only mean something when there is another person to share them. But this particular Tuesday in May of 1882, Harriet had driven the wagon into Colby Creek to collect a package of seeds from the dry goods store and to pick up Eli from the schoolhouse at the end of the day, and she had passed the registration booth for the livestock competition, which was set up in front of the hotel, and Me Perkins had been behind the table. And Me Perkins had always been the kind of woman who said things that were meant to be helpful but landed in a way that was not quite. Harriet Wallace, Me had said, with the particular brightness that suggested she was genuinely pleased to see her, and also filing away everything about the encounter for later discussion. "Are you entering this year? I noticed you have that big red and white bull. Someone mentioned seeing him from the road. A fine-looking animal." Harriet had stopped the wagon and climbed down because it was rude to hold a conversation from the seat of a wagon when the other person was standing at ground level. "He is a fine animal," she said. "Of course, you'd be up against Harvey Brooks again," Me said, lowering her voice slightly, which in Me's case meant it was only audible to people within about 15 feet rather than 30. "His operation has just grown something remarkable. Everyone says he'll take first again this year without much contest. I suppose it's a different category of ranching altogether, what he's doing versus what a smaller operation might manage. No offense intended, of course." Harriet had looked at Me Perkins for a moment in the particular way she had of looking at things that required a measured response, and then she had picked up the pencil from the table, written her name on the clipboard under the cattle category, placed her 2 silver coins carefully in the tin box provided, and said, "No offense taken, Me," before climbing back into the wagon and continuing down the street. She had registered in a moment of pique. She would admit that to herself later. She had registered because Me Perkins' tone had suggested that Harriet Wallace showing up to compete was a mild absurdity, a plucky gesture by a woman in a smaller category of existence, and Harriet had never in her life responded well to being placed in a smaller category of existence. But by the time she reached the dry goods store and was collecting her seed packet, the pique had settled into something else, something that felt more like decision. She was going to enter. She was going to bring her best animal, which was in fact an exceptional specimen that she had been watching develop with considerable private satisfaction for the past year, and she was going to see what happened. She told Eli about it on the drive home, and he had sat up straighter on the wagon seat and said, "Which one are we bringing?" with the focus of a person who understood immediately that this was a serious question deserving serious consideration. This was one of the reasons Harriet loved her son as fiercely and completely as she did. "Monarch," she said. Eli nodded once slowly, the way he nodded when something had been decided and was correct. "Good choice," he said. Monarch was a 3-year-old Hereford bull that Harriet had bred from her best cow, a patient and substantial animal named Clover, and a fine-blooded sire that a passing rancher had allowed for the service fee 2 springs back. From the moment he was born, Harriet had known Monarch was different. He had a solidity and a presence that went beyond simple size, a kind of authority in the way he moved, and stood that made other animals in the pasture orient toward him without any particular drama. He was deep-chested and broad-shouldered with the red coat and white face of his breed, and he had a temperament that was calm without being dull, which in Harriet's experience was the rarest and most valuable combination in any living creature, bovine or otherwise. She had spent the weeks leading up to the competition grooming and conditioning Monarch. With the same quiet dedication she applied to everything she decided to do. She cleaned and polished his hooves. She brushed his coat until it had a depth and sheen that caught the light. She walked him on a lead rope every morning so that he was accustomed to being handled and would present well before the judges. Eli helped, talking to the bull in low, conversational tones that Monarch seemed to appreciate, or at least tolerate with good humor. Clem watched all of this with wide eyes and said, on a Thursday 2 weeks before the competition, "Mrs. Wallace, I believe that might be the finest bull in this part of Kansas." "I know it," Harriet said, without looking up from the leg she was examining. The day the competition began, Harriet loaded Monarch into the transport pen on the back of the wagon with a composure she had worked at. Because she was nervous, she could admit that privately. She was nervous not because she doubted Monarch, but because she had not done this in 3 years, and she was going to walk into a field full of ranchers, most of whom would look at her, and see a widow with a small operation and a borrowed confidence. And she was going to have to stand very straight and simply proceed, which she knew how to do, but which still required a particular kind of effort on mornings when the world arranged itself in ways designed to make a person feel small. Eli rode in the wagon beside her, wearing his good shirt and his hat that he had cleaned with a damp cloth the night before without being asked. She glanced at him sideways and felt the particular compressed fullness in her chest that she had come to understand was what love felt like when it was very large and could not be entirely contained in the ordinary dimensions of a day. "Whatever happens," she said, "we know what Monarch is." "Yes, we do," Eli said, with complete conviction. The fairgrounds outside Colby Creek were already busy when they arrived. Wagons and horses and voices, and the particular complex smell of livestock and hay and food cooking, and wood smoke that Harriet associated with these events and that hit her, when she climbed down from the wagon, with a wave of memory so specific and so vivid that she had to stand still for a moment and just let it move through her. Robert at her side 3 years ago, complaining good-naturedly about the parking situation. Robert's hand at her back as they walked toward the judging ring. The way he had tipped his hat to Harvey Brooks with genuine respect even while being quietly competitive about the whole enterprise. She breathed in, breathed out, and went to collect her competition number from the registration table. It was while she was pinning the numbered card to her jacket that she became aware of being watched, and she looked up to find Harvey Brooks standing about 12 feet away, holding a cup of coffee and looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. She had seen Harvey Brooks before, of course, at various town events and occasional encounters in the feed store or the street, but she had not had a sustained conversation with the man, partly because their interactions had always been brief and contextual, and partly because Harvey Brooks had a reputation for being a serious, private kind of person who was not given to small talk, and who most people in Colby Creek either deeply respected or found mildly intimidating, and sometimes both at once. He was, she noted in the way one notes things that are simply true, a striking-looking man. He was 35 years old. She knew this from general town knowledge, tall and lean with broad shoulders and the kind of deep-tanned face that comes from years of working outdoors in the Kansas sun. He had dark eyes and dark hair that was cut neatly enough to suggest he paid some attention to his appearance without being vain about it, and there was a stillness to how he held himself that was not unfriendly exactly, but was very contained, as though he was accustomed to taking in a great deal of information from the world around him, and was not in a hurry to respond to any of it. He walked toward her and she finished pinning her number and stood straight and met his eyes because that was simply what she did. "Mrs. Wallace," he said, and his voice was lower than she had expected, the kind of voice that seemed to come from somewhere with a lot of space in it. "Harvey Brooks, I believe we've met in passing." "We have," she said. "Mr. Brooks, twice at the judging ring, in fact. My husband's bull took second to yours both times." Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been respect or might have been surprise or might have been both. "He did," Harvey said, "and both times it was closer than the ribbons suggested. Your husband had a good eye." "He did," Harriet said, and the past tense of that was its own small weight, but she carried it without showing the effort because she had been carrying it for 3 years and had gotten reasonably good at the balance. "I saw the entry list," Harvey said, and there was a slight pause before he continued as though he was choosing his words. "I noticed your name. Did that surprise you?" He considered this with what seemed like genuine thought rather than polite deflection. "It didn't surprise me," he said slowly. "I've seen your herd from the road. You've built something solid out there." Since he paused. "In the last few years. Monarch is in pen 14 if you'd like to see what you're up against," Harriet said, because she was not interested in dancing around the subject. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, still eyes, and then something happened in the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. "I'll take you up on that," he said. They walked together to pen 14, which was a stranger thing than Harriet had anticipated, walking beside Harvey Brooks through the noise and activity of the fairgrounds, aware of the particular frequency of attention that they were generating from people around them, the glances that were not quite subtle and the greetings that came with a certain additional quality of interest. Harriet noted this and chose not to be bothered by it, and apparently Harvey Brooks was either unaware of it or similarly unbothered, because he walked with his same unhurried composure and did not seem to feel the need to fill the space between them with nervous conversation. When they reached pen 14 and Monarch raised his broad head and regarded them with the calm authority he brought to all things, Harvey Brooks was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Harriet stood beside him and waited, because she knew what was happening. She had been watching people encounter Monarch for the first time long enough to understand the particular quality of silence that preceded a genuine assessment from someone who actually knew what they were looking at. "Well," Harvey Brooks said, finally. "Yes," Harriet said, "he is remarkable. I know it." He turned his head and looked at her, and this time the corner of the mouth thing was definitely a smile, small and genuine and slightly reluctant, as though smiling was something he did not do automatically but was doing now because the situation had simply called it out of him. "I brought my best animal too," he said, "a 4-year-old by the name of Titan." "I know," Harriet said. "I saw him on the entry list." "Well," he looked back at Monarch, "this will be interesting." "I thought so," Harriet said. He excused himself shortly after to attend to his own preparations, and Harriet watched him walk away, and then turned back to Monarch and checked the lead rope and the water bucket and all the practical things that needed checking. And she did this with perfect efficiency, and only the smallest, most private acknowledgement that something about the last 15 minutes had rearranged the air around her in a way she had not expected and was not sure yet what to do with. The first day of the competition was devoted to initial judging in all categories, a preliminary round that would narrow the field before the final judging on the third day. Harriet led Monarch through his paces before the 3 judges with the same calm steadiness she brought to everything, holding the lead rope with the right amount of firmness and allowing Monarch to present himself, which he did magnificently, moving with his characteristic ease and standing when asked with a presence that drew attention from the crowd around the ring. She was aware of Harvey Brooks watching from the far side of the ring, his arms folded across his chest and his expression unreadable in the way it generally seemed to be. And she was aware of various other people watching with a different quality of attention, the kind that contained surprise and a certain recalibration, because Harriet Wallace and her bull were clearly not a joke, were not the plucky gesture of a widow managing a small operation, were instead something that the competition was going to have to take seriously. This felt, she decided, very good. After the preliminary judging, which placed both Monarch and Titan in the final round, Harriet handed Monarch's lead to Eli, who had arrived on foot from the schoolhouse end of things and was now taking over the afternoon feeding and watering duties with complete seriousness. and she walked toward the food area where several long tables had been set up, and where various women from town were selling pies and cornbread and coffee and roasted corn, and where the general noise and warmth of the fair was at its most concentrated and pleasant. She bought a cup of coffee and a piece of dried apple pie and found a space at the end of a table near the edge of the gathering, and she had been sitting there for perhaps 5 minutes when Harvey Brooks appeared on the other side of the table and said, without preamble, "May I sit here?" There were other spaces at other tables. He had chosen this one deliberately. She noted this and said, "Of course." He sat down with his own coffee and a piece of cornbread and looked out at the fairgrounds for a moment before saying, "Your boy handles Monarch well." "He has a gift," Harriet said. "How old?" "8." Harvey Brooks nodded, and there was something in his face that she noticed but could not immediately place, a shadow of something that was not quite sadness but was in that general territory of the interior places, where people keep the things that are not for general circulation. "Smart-looking boy," he said. "He is," Harriet said. "He gets the smartness from both sides and the stubbornness entirely from me." Harvey Brooks looked at her with those dark eyes, and this time the smile came more freely, not large but real, and it changed his face in a way that was quite significant. He had a good face when it moved, she thought, not just striking in the still, contained way it was at rest, but actually warm and interesting when something genuine moved through it. "What made you enter this year?" he asked, and his tone was curious rather than challenging. "Me Perkins," Harriet said. He raised an eyebrow. "She implied it would be a charming effort," Harriet said. "I'm not interested in charming efforts." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his version of being genuinely entertained. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you are." They sat together for another half-hour, and the conversation moved in the easy, substantive way of two people who are both accustomed to thinking practically, and who have both been spending a lot of time in their own company, and find the presence of a particular other person unexpectedly refreshing. They talked about cattle breeding and the difficulty of the last summer's drought, and what the new railroad spur being built 20 miles south might mean for livestock transport. And then they talked about the land itself. And this was where the conversation became something more than practical. Because when Harvey Brooks talked about the land, he talked about it differently than most people did. Not just as a resource or a challenge, but as something that had its own character, its own demands, its own kind of beauty, that you had to earn the right to see by putting in sufficient time and attention. Harriet found herself leaning forward slightly without intending to, because she recognized this way of seeing, and it was not a way she had found in many other people, and it surprised her to find it in Harvey Brooks, who she had always thought of in the abstract as simply the competition, the benchmark, the name at the top of the judging results. "You've been ranching this land yourself for how long?" she asked. 12 years, he said. "I came out from Missouri when I was 23. Bought the land with money I'd saved from 2 years of trail work and a winter of trapping that I don't particularly want to remember. No family out here. No." He said it simply, without performance. "My parents passed before I left Missouri. I have a sister in Ohio. We write when we remember to." He looked at the fairgrounds for a moment and then back at her. "And you, before Colby Creek." "Indiana," she said. "My father farmed corn. I married Robert at 22 and we came west because he wanted to build something that was genuinely his and there was more room for it out here." "And you?" Harvey said. "Did you want that too?" The question was precise and perceptive, and no one had asked her quite that exact question before. She considered it honestly. "I wanted to build something too," she said. "I just didn't know until I was doing it that I was doing it at least as much as Robert was. I think he knew toward the end. He said something once about how the land knew whose hands were in it most hours." She paused. He meant it as a compliment. Harvey was quiet for a moment, and when he looked at her his expression had that quality she had noticed before, the interior one, but now she placed it more accurately. It was loneliness, the specific variety that belongs to people who are fundamentally private and who have been alone for a long time and have built good accommodations for that fact, but who, in the presence of the right kind of company, feel the shape of what has been absent. She recognized it because she had it too. She did not say any of this because it was a first conversation and these were large things, and instead she said, "I should get back to Eli. He's responsible with Monarch, but he's still 8 and I promised him supper before the evening." Harvey Brooks stood when she did, which was the kind of manners that had been built in rather than applied, she could tell, and he said, "Mrs. Wallace, I look forward to the final judging." "As do I," she said, and she meant it on more than one level, which she only fully recognized as she was walking back toward Pen 14. The evening of the first competition day brought the fiddle music and the dancing at the hotel, and Harriet attended with Eli until 8 o'clock, which was his bedtime at home, and which she extended slightly as a fair concession, and they watched the dancing and ate pulled pork from the supper table, and Harriet allowed herself the pleasure of simply being present in the warmth and noise of it, without the heaviness of the last 3 years pressing quite as hard as it sometimes did. Harvey Brooks was at the dance. He was not dancing. He was standing with 2 other men of the ranching sort near the far wall with a glass of something that was probably whiskey, and he was doing the thing with his arms folded, and his expression contained that seemed to be his natural resting state in social situations. But when he caught her eye across the room, he unfolded his arms and nodded, and she nodded back. And Eli looked between them and then looked up at his mother with the particular observant intelligence that she simultaneously loved and found occasionally inconvenient. "Who is that man?" Eli asked. "Harvey Brooks," Harriet said. "He's a rancher. He's entering the cattle competition." "Is he good?" "He is very good," she said honestly. "He's won this competition 3 years running." Eli considered this. "But not this year," he said with complete certainty. "We will see," Harriet said, but she was smiling when she said it. The second day of the competition was for other categories, the hog judging and the horse showing and the various agricultural exhibits, and Harriet took Eli through all of it with the pleasure of someone who genuinely loves this world, the smell of good hay and clean animals, the particular conversations that happen between people who work with land and livestock and speak the same practical language. She entered her dried apple preserves in the domestic category, not because she had any great expectation of winning, but because she had 3 dozen jars of them and they were excellent, and it seemed wasteful not to. She ran into Harvey Brooks at the horse paddock, where he was examining a young mare that someone had entered for sale rather than competition. He was running his hand along the animal's shoulder with the focused attention of someone who was actually seeing rather than performing the gesture, and the mare was standing very still, which told Harriet something, because horses are accurate. He looked up when she appeared beside him. "Sound," he said, as though they were continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. "The hock on the left has a small irregularity, probably from an early injury, but it won't give her trouble." Harriet looked at the hock and saw what he was describing. "She's been compensating slightly for a while," Harriet said. "Look at the muscle development on the right shoulder, more developed. She's been favoring the right more than she should." Harvey studied this for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I missed that." "The hock caught your attention first. Yours didn't. I looked at the whole animal before I looked at any part," she said. "Robert taught me that. He said if you look at the part first you miss what the whole is telling you." Harvey looked at the whole mare for a moment. "Smart man," he said quietly. "He was," Harriet said, and there was no heaviness in it today, which she noticed with a small private surprise, just a simple true statement about a person who had been real and good and was gone. They walked through the rest of the horse paddock together without quite deciding to, talking about bloodlines and training, and the particular challenge of working with young animals that had spirit without having trust yet. And Harriet was aware that they had fallen into an ease of conversation that usually took much longer to develop between people who were essentially strangers, but that did not feel premature or strange. It felt like the kind of ease that comes when two people are made of similar materials and simply recognize it. Eli found them near the paddock fence and attached himself to Harriet's side and looked up at Harvey Brooks with the clear-eyed assessment of a child who trusts his own judgment about people, which Harriet had learned to take seriously. "You have a lot of cattle," Eli said to Harvey without preamble. "I do," Harvey said, looking down at the boy without talking down to him, which Harriet noted. "More than us," Eli said. "More than most people in the county," Harvey agreed. "Do you have children?" Eli asked. "Eli," Harriet said. "It's all right," Harvey said and looked at the boy steadily. "No, I don't. I'm not married." He paused. "Do you help your mother with the herd?" "Every day," Eli said with quiet pride. "I handle the feeding in the mornings mostly, and I help with the fence checking on Saturdays, and I'm learning to read the animal's condition the way Mama does." "That's important work," Harvey said seriously. Eli nodded with the gravity of someone receiving accurate information they already knew. "I know it," he said, in a phrasing so precisely like his mother's that Harvey looked at Harriet with that small, genuine smile again, and she looked away before the smile she was feeling could be too visible. That evening, after she had put Eli to bed in the room they had taken at the hotel for the 3 days of the fair, Harriet sat on the small balcony of the room in the warm May night and listened to the distant fiddle music still going from the saloon, and thought about the way the day had arranged itself around Harvey Brooks in a manner that had not been planned, and that she was not sure what to do with. She was not a woman who confused herself about her own feelings, generally. She had always been constitutionally direct with herself, even when the truth was complicated or uncomfortable. And the truth right now was that she had spent 2 days in the company of a man she had previously known only as an abstract competitive presence, and she had found him to be someone she genuinely liked and was genuinely interested in, and that this felt both natural and deeply unexpected, like finding a spring in land you thought you knew thoroughly. She was also honest with herself about the fact that she had not had these particular feelings in a very long time, not since the early years with Robert, and that there was something both exhilarating and faintly frightening about encountering them again. The way a muscle you have not used in a long time makes itself known at first use, not with pain exactly, but with a vivid, unfamiliar presence. She sat with this honestly and did not try to resolve it, because the final judging was tomorrow, and whatever happened would happen, and she was a practical woman who knew the order in which things had to come. The morning of the final judging day was clear and bright, with a breeze coming in from the northwest that made the fairground banners snap, and the animals alert and interested in the general proceedings. Harriet braided Monarch's tail with a practiced hand, while Eli held the lead rope and talked to the bull in his low, easy way, and she felt the clean pleasure of doing something she was good at in conditions that made it possible to do it well. Harvey Brooks came by pen 14 at 8 in the morning, which was earlier than she had expected, and he stood at the fence rail and watched her work for a moment before saying, "He's going to be difficult to beat." "I know it," she said. "I thought you might want to know that Titan took a slight knock to his left front leg last night. Nothing serious, but he'll be slightly off his best presentation. The judges will see it." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him directly. This was information he had not been required to share. It was, in fact, information that served her interest and not his. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He met her eyes evenly. "Because the competition should be decided by the animals," he said, "not by accidents of circumstance. And because if Monarch beats Titan today, I want it to be because Monarch was better, not because Titan was disadvantaged." She looked at him for a long moment, and what she felt in that moment was something she would have found difficult to articulate precisely, but that had something to do with the quality of his integrity, the way it was simply present without being performed, the way it extended to situations in which he had no audience and nothing to gain by it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Win honestly." "That was always the plan," she said. He walked away, and she turned back to Monarch's braid, and she was smiling, actually smiling. in a way that she was grateful no one was close enough to see clearly except Eli, who saw it and looked thoughtful and did not say anything, which was very much the right response. The final judging ring was crowded with spectators on all four sides, ranchers and townspeople and children who had climbed up on the fence rails for a better view. There were 6 bulls in the final cattle category, impressive animals all of them, bred and conditioned by people who knew what they were doing. Titan was among them, and Harriet could see the slight irregularity Harvey had mentioned, nothing dramatic, barely visible to someone who was not looking for it, but there, if you knew how to read movement. Monarch entered the ring as though he owned it, which was essentially his attitude toward all spaces he entered, and the quality of attention from the crowd shifted in that particular way that happened when something genuinely excellent appeared, a collective intake and focus that was the most honest form of appreciation. Harriet walked him through the ring with the lead rope loose enough to show that he was not being controlled, but taut enough to demonstrate that she was in authority, which was the correct balance and one that required both skill and genuine relationship with the animal. She stood straight and moved with him and tried not to be aware of the 3 judges conferring at their table, and mostly succeeded. It took 40 minutes for the judging of all 6 animals. And then there was the conferring period that lasted what felt to Harriet like considerably longer than the 15 minutes it actually was. And then the head judge, a man from Abilene named Preston, who had the manner of someone who had seen every caliber of livestock and was no longer impressed by anything that did not genuinely deserve it, walked to the center of the ring with the ribbons and the envelope. 3rd place went to a red-coated bull named Duke, whose owner, a rancher from the eastern part of the county, accepted the yellow ribbon with visible pleasure. 2nd place went to Titan, and Harvey Brooks walked into the ring to collect the red ribbon with the same composure he brought to everything, without visible disappointment, and he glanced at Harriet as he took the ribbon, and his expression was completely neutral in the way that things that are genuinely felt are sometimes neutral on the surface. And in 1st place, Preston said, with what this panel agrees is one of the finest examples of Hereford breeding we have seen at this competition in many years, number 14, Monarch, owned, and presented by Mrs. Harriet Wallace of Colby Creek. The noise from the crowd was immediate and genuine, and Harriet walked into the ring to collect the blue ribbon and the trophy, which was a substantial brass thing on a wooden base, heavier than she had expected. And she held it and looked at it for a moment and then looked up at the crowd and the sky and the banners snapping in the northwest breeze, and she felt something that was large and warm and entirely her own, not Robert's, not anyone's legacy or continuation, simply hers. She was aware of Harvey Brooks still standing at the edge of the ring with his red ribbon, and she looked at him, and he was looking back at her, and whatever he was feeling was moving in his face now, not contained, not still, something open and genuine and not entirely composed. She walked toward him because the ring was clearing and it was a natural direction, and when she reached him she said, "Your animal was exceptional." "So was yours," he said. His voice was slightly different, she noticed, a fraction less controlled. "More than exceptional. You've done something remarkable with that bull." "We've done something remarkable," she said. "Eli and I," he nodded. He was still looking at her with that open, uncontained expression, and she recognized it now fully and correctly, and it moved through her like the sound of the fiddle music, clear and resonant and surprising even when you knew it was coming. They stood there for a moment in the clearing ring with the crowd moving around them, and then Harvey Brooks did something that was apparently not planned, and that startled him as much as it startled her, because she could see the surprise in his own face even as the words came out of him. "Mrs. Wallace," he said, "I wonder if you'd allow me to take supper with you and Eli tonight." It was not a proposal, it was supper. But they both knew it was not entirely just supper, and the knowing was mutual and visible and honest in the way that honest things are often simultaneously simple and enormous. "I think we'd like that," Harriet said. Supper was at the hotel dining room, which was the best restaurant in Colby Creek by the simple virtue of being the only one, and it served a passable beef stew and very good bread and a pie that was not as good as Harriet's but was fine for a hotel. Eli ate with the unself-conscious appetite of a healthy 8-year-old and asked Harvey Brooks a series of questions about cattle breeding that demonstrated both his genuine knowledge and his mother's influence. And Harvey answered them with the seriousness they deserved, and the two of them fell into a conversation about the relative merits of different forage grasses that Harriet was happy to largely observe. She observed it with a fullness that she had not felt in a long time, and that she let herself simply have, without analyzing or diminishing or preparing a defense against. When Eli fell asleep at the table at 8:30, Harriet carried him upstairs to the room, which was a feat she was still capable of because he was not yet as large as he thought he was, and when she came back downstairs, Harvey was still at the table with his coffee, and he stood when she entered the room and did not sit again until she was seated, and she thought. He was raised well, and whoever raised him, it stuck. They sat with their coffee in the quieter dining room, most of the other guests having finished their suppers, and the fiddle music was a distant accompaniment from somewhere down the street, and Harvey Brooks said, "Can I ask you something directly?" "I generally prefer directness," she said. "I know it," he said, and the gentle echo of her own phrasing made her look up quickly and find him watching her with that warm, uncontained expression. He cleared his throat slightly, which was the only outward sign she had seen of anything approaching nervousness in the man. "I've been running my operation alone for 12 years, he said, and I've been satisfied with that in the way you can be satisfied with something that is genuinely good but that is also genuinely incomplete. She was still. The fiddle music came through the window, something slow. "I haven't met many people who see the land the way I see it," he said. "And I haven't met many people who I can talk to without feeling like I'm translating every other sentence into something they can follow." He paused. "And I haven't met anyone in a long time who I thought about after they walked away." The honesty of it, the complete absence of performance or strategic presentation, hit her somewhere precise and specific. "I'm not saying this well," he said. "You're saying it exactly well," she said, and her voice was steadier than she would have expected given the current condition of her interior. "I realize we've known each other for 2 days," he said. "I realize this is not the conventional order of things. I'm not asking you for an answer to anything tonight. I'm asking you whether," he stopped and seemed to be reformulating. "I'm asking whether you'd be willing to continue, to let this be the beginning of something rather than just 3 days at a competition." Harriet looked at this man across the table, at the honesty and the stillness and the single line of concern between his brows that was there, because he genuinely did not know what she was going to say. And she thought about 3 years of mornings that began in the dark with work to be done, and a vast and particular silence on the other side of the bed. And she thought about Eli asking if he had children with the clear-eyed accuracy of a child who was assessing something. And she thought about the way he had told her about Titan's leg because the competition should be decided by the animals. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing to continue." The breath he let out was almost inaudible. Almost. She heard it. "Good," he said, and the word was simple and complete. They returned to their respective properties the following morning, Harriet with the trophy secured carefully in the wagon bed, and Monarch placid in his transport pen, and Eli asleep against her shoulder for the first 10 miles of the drive home. And the drive back across the Kansas land in the May morning was so beautiful that Harriet had to simply stop once and look at it. The grass and the sky and the light on the distant tree line of the creek bed. And she looked at it and thought, "I am still here and still living, and the world is still very large and very good, and there are things still coming." The weeks that followed had a shape that Harriet had not anticipated and that she found herself grateful for. Harvey Brooks came to the Wallace property on the following Saturday, arriving in the early afternoon with no particular pretense of a reason and a jar of coffee beans. He said he had ordered from a merchant in Abilene and found he had more of than he needed, which made Harriet smile because the offering was a courtesy rather than a necessity, but presented as a practicality because that was the only mode he had. She made coffee and they sat on the front porch and talked, while Eli ran between the barn and the near pasture checking on things that he deemed in need of checking. And the afternoon moved slowly in the way of afternoons in May in Kansas when the light is long and there is nowhere you need to be. He came the following Saturday as well, and the one after that. And by the fourth Saturday, it was simply the thing that happened on Saturdays. And Eli had come to expect it with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who processes new realities quickly when they feel fundamentally right. On the fifth Saturday, Harvey brought a young heifer he was considering for Harriet's breeding program, a Hereford like Monarch's mother, with similar conformation, and a disposition he said had impressed him. He walked her through the near pasture while Harriet observed, and Eli walked alongside Harvey asking questions, and the three of them moved through the afternoon grass together with the easy coordination of people who have established a rhythm. And Harriet watched this from slightly behind and felt that fullness again, the large, warm thing that could not be entirely contained. In June, she began going to his property on occasional weekday mornings, leaving Eli with Clem for a few hours, ostensibly to look at the improvements Harvey was making to his north pasture fencing, and then to discuss his ideas about rotating the grazing areas, and then simply because the drive across the land between their properties was pleasant, and because Harvey Brooks on his own property was a slightly different thing than Harvey Brooks anywhere else, more at ease, more open. Moving through his world with the confidence of someone who has built every part of it himself and knows every corner of it with the intimacy of long acquaintance. He showed her the changes he had made to the original farmhouse, which was considerably larger than hers, 3 rooms now and a covered porch that ran the full front length. And when he showed it to her, he did so in the way of someone presenting something for an opinion they genuinely wanted, not performing but asking, and she gave her opinions honestly because that was what was wanted, and because the house was good and worth honest comment. "The kitchen is too small for the scale of the rest of it," she said. "I know," he said. "I never got around to fixing that because it only matters if he stopped." She looked at him. He was looking at the kitchen. "If there was someone who actually used it as a kitchen," he finished, very carefully. She looked at the kitchen too. It was indeed too small. "The east wall could be taken out without affecting the structure," she said. "You could extend it 12 feet and have a very useful kitchen." "I think that's exactly right," he said, and neither of them said anything else about it, but the conversation was very much not finished and they both knew it. In July, there was a bad week. It came without announcement, the way these things do. A letter arrived from Harriet's sister in St. Louis, sent with good intentions and received badly, suggesting that Harriet must be lonely, and perhaps should consider whether Colby Creek was really the right place for a widow to be raising a son alone, whether coming back east might not be the more sensible option. Harriet read the letter twice, put it in the drawer, took it out again, and did something she had not done in almost 3 years. She sat down at the kitchen table in the middle of the afternoon and simply cried, not with grief exactly, but with the accumulated weight of having been strong and practical and self-sufficient for 3 years straight without a break, and with the sudden sharp articulation of how tired she sometimes was of making every decision alone. She did not tell Harvey about the letter when he came that Saturday. But Harvey Brooks was not a man who missed things, and he had sat with her on the porch for half an hour before he said, quietly, without making it large, "Something's not right today." She had looked at the view from the porch for a moment before deciding that honesty was simply what she did, and she told him about the letter, and about the tiredness behind it, and about the specific kind of loneliness that had nothing to do with being unhappy with the life she had built and everything to do with the sheer weight of it. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he listened completely, not constructing his response while she was still speaking but actually hearing everything first. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Do you want to stay here, in Colby Creek, on your land?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, "more than anything." "Then the letter is answerable," he said simply. She looked at him. He was looking at the view from the porch with his arms resting on his knees and his expression that interior one. But there was something else in it now, something that was working up to a decision. He turned and looked at her directly, with those dark eyes that she had spent months learning to read and still found could contain more than she expected. "Harriet," he said, and the use of her first name, which had been happening for a few weeks now in the easy, natural way of people who have moved past the formal distance, still had a frequency to it she felt specifically. "I want to say something that I've been working toward for some time now, and I want to say it correctly, so I'll ask you to be patient with me." "Take your time," she said, and she was very still. "I have had a very good life," he said, "by any reasonable measure. I have land I love and work I believe in, and I have been free to do things my own way, which matters to me. But I have spent most of that life in a kind of voluntary isolation that I told myself was independence, and that I am now prepared to admit was partly fear. Not of work or difficulty, but of," he looked away briefly and then back, "of wanting something I might not get, of building a life around a person and having that person be gone." She understood this with the deep accuracy of someone who had lived the thing he was afraid of. "I've watched you," he said. "For these months, I've watched you manage loss and loneliness and a workload that would defeat most people, and do it with a dignity and an honesty and a humor that I have found." He paused. "Harriet, I have found you to be the most remarkable person I have encountered in my adult life, and I have known for some weeks that I am in love with you, and I am asking you if you are willing to marry me." The porch was very quiet. Somewhere in the middle distance, Eli was making the particular sound he made when he was organizing the horses, a low, repeated whistle that meant "come here" in the specific language he had developed with the animals. "You've been working toward that for some time," she said. "Since May," he said, "more or less since the first morning at the competition." "That's a considerable amount of work," she said, and her voice was not quite as steady as she would have liked, but she did not try to correct it. "I wanted to be sure," he said, "and I wanted to be sure you were sure too." She looked at this man, this careful, honest, contained, and deeply feeling man who had come to her Saturdays with coffee beans and herded questions, and told her about a knocked leg because the competition should be decided by the animals. And she thought about the kitchen that was too small for the scale of the rest of it, and about Eli whistling to the horses in the middle distance, and about 3 years of mornings that had been hers alone and would now, if she said yes, be shared. "Yes," she said. "Harvey Brooks, I will marry you." He let out a long breath, and for a moment he simply looked at her with everything unhidden in his face, all the hope and the relief, and the feeling that he had been keeping contained for months, and it was the most open she had ever seen another person's face, and she felt the absolute rightness of it settle through her like water finding its level. He reached across and took her hand just that, and held it, and they sat on the porch in the July afternoon with the sun on the grass and Eli's whistle in the distance, and it was one of the most complete moments Harriet had ever inhabited. "I should ask Eli," Harvey said after a time. "You should," she agreed. "Do you think he'll say yes?" She thought about Eli at the competition, assessing Harvey with those clear eyes. She thought about Eli's increasing comfort in Harvey's company over the months of Saturdays. She thought about Eli asking him questions about grass rotations with a seriousness that Harvey received as a serious person would. "I think he's been expecting this," she said. Harvey looked at her. "Have I been that obvious?" "To a child who pays attention," she said. "Yes. To me Perkins, no doubt also yes. The entire town has probably been discussing it for at least 6 weeks." Something crossed his face that was entirely delighted and slightly horrified. The entire town. We live in a small town, Harvey. I'm aware of that. And you come to my property every Saturday. I brought coffee beans the first time, he said, with a dignity that made her laugh, actually laugh out loud, the full sound of it, and he looked at her laughing, and his face did the thing where the warmth came through completely, and he laughed too. And the sound of both of them together on the porch was something that Harriet thought she would carry with her for a very long time. When Eli came in from the pasture 40 minutes later, Harvey Brooks sat him down on the porch step and talked to him the way he talked to him always, directly and without condescension. And he told Eli that he loved his mother, and that he was hoping to marry her, and that he wanted very much to be a real part of their family, but that he knew Eli had been the man of the house for 3 years, and he was not trying to replace anyone or diminish anything that had come before. Eli listened with his serious 8-year-old face, looking at Harvey with those clear, assessing eyes, and when Harvey finished, Eli was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My father is buried under the cottonwood tree on the far east edge of the property." "I know," Harvey said. "We visit on Sundays sometimes," Eli said. "Mama and me." "That seems right," Harvey said. Eli looked at him for another moment. "You'd need to know about Monarch's feeding schedule," he said finally. "He has particular requirements." Harvey looked at Eli with an expression that contained everything he was feeling about this response, and everything he felt about the child who had given it. "I'd be glad to learn them," he said. Eli nodded once slowly, the definitive nod. "All right then," he said. The wedding was in September, 6 weeks later, at the church in Colby Creek on a Saturday morning when the sky was the deep blue of early autumn and the cottonwood trees along the creek were beginning to turn yellow. Harriet wore her good dress, which she had altered herself and which fitted her well, and Harvey wore his good suit, which fitted him less well because it had been made some years ago, and he had gotten broader in the shoulders since. A fact that Harriet's neighbor Clara, who was handy with a needle, had corrected in the week before the ceremony. Me Perkins was there, of course, in the front pew, and her expression throughout the ceremony was one of enormous satisfaction at a development she had entirely not predicted, but was now absolutely in favor of, and would certainly be describing as something she had sensed coming, which was all right, Harriet thought, because the world was large enough for Me Perkins to have her version of events and Harriet to have her own. Eli stood beside Harvey at the front of the church, having been appointed to this role by Harvey himself, who said he could not think of a better man to stand beside, which had made Eli stand about 2 inches taller than his natural height. Pastor Greenwood read the words, and Harvey said his with the same directness and seriousness with which he said everything, looking at Harriet with those dark eyes in that open, unhidden way. And Harriet said hers looking straight back at him, and the moment when it was done had that quality of certain moments that are both exactly what you expected and entirely more than you expected at the same time. After the ceremony, the reception was held at the hotel, where Clara and several other women of the town had organized a supper that was considerably better than any hotel supper had a right to be. And there was dancing again, fiddle music, and the flat stomp of boots on the wooden floor. And this time Harvey Brooks was not standing against the wall with his arms folded. He asked her to dance with the same careful, direct quality he brought to everything he asked her, and she said yes. And he danced with the focused attention of someone who has learned to do something and done it thoroughly enough to be genuinely good at it. And they moved together on the floor of the hotel in Colby Creek, Kansas, on a September evening in 1882, and Harriet thought, "I did not plan for this, and I did not see it coming, and I am so glad of both of those things." Moving her belongings and Eli's belongings to Harvey's property took 2 weeks, with Clem making multiple trips in the wagon and Harvey making equally multiple trips, and the whole enterprise having a pleasant chaos about it. Clem stayed on as a full-time hand, which pleased everyone including Clem, who had by this point grown from 17 to nearly 19, and had the particular status of someone who had been loyal to the operation before it became something larger than itself. The kitchen extension Harvey had mentioned was built that October by 3 men from town and Harvey himself, with Harriet overseeing the placement of the new wood stove and the arrangement of the shelves, with the authority of someone who has very clear opinions about where things should go. And Harvey deferred to every one of these opinions because he had quickly understood that Harriet's opinions about the practical arrangement of things were not preferences but conclusions, arrived at through actual thinking about actual requirements. The combined property was now the most substantial private operation in Colby Creek and 2 counties over, and the cattle herd that combined Harvey's existing animals with Harriet's, including Monarch and Clover and Monarch's promising offspring, numbered 43 head going into the winter, which was by any measure a significant enterprise. They worked it together with a complementarity that felt less like compromise and more like the way 2 strong currents join into a single river, each retaining its character while becoming part of something larger. They were not always easy with each other. It would not be honest to say otherwise. Harvey had spent 12 years doing things his own way and had specific habits of organization that occasionally conflicted with Harriet's equally specific habits of organization. And there were arguments, real ones, not cruel but frank, about the placement of the winter feed stores and the timing of the spring rotation, and once a fairly sustained disagreement about the merits of a particular fence design that lasted through most of a Tuesday evening, and resolved at midnight in the way that disagreements between 2 people who respect each other's minds generally do resolve, not with one person winning, but with both people having genuinely changed the other's position through the exchange. In the spring of 1883, Harriet became pregnant. She knew it with the bodily certainty that comes with having been through it before, and she told Harvey on a morning in March when they were standing in the kitchen drinking coffee before the day began, and his reaction was one she would remember. He set down his coffee cup very carefully on the counter, which was a gesture of someone who needed a moment, and then he turned and looked at her, and his face was completely open, something she still found striking every time it happened, that total openness in a man who had spent years being contained. "Are you well?" he asked, and the first thing being her health rather than his own response was so precisely him that she felt it with the particular warmth of knowing someone well. "Very well," she said. He came to her then and held her, simply held her, in the kitchen in the March morning light, and she leaned into him and thought about cottonwood trees and blue ribbons and the way things ended and began. She told Eli on a Sunday walk to the cottonwood tree, because she felt Robert should know, and because Eli deserved to hear it in a quiet and truthful place. Eli was 9 years old and understood more than a 9-year-old was strictly supposed to understand about the world, and he listened and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We don't know yet," Harriet said. "I'd like a brother," Eli said, with the considered honesty of someone stating a preference without demanding it, "but either would be acceptable." Harriet looked at the cottonwood tree and said quietly, to the tree and to Robert Wallace and to the clear spring sky, "A person could not ask for a better son." The baby was born in October of 1883, a healthy boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn set to the jaw, and they named him Thomas after Harvey's father, whose name Harvey had not spoken in conversation before but spoke now with a quietness that was its own kind of tribute. Eli held his brother with the gravity of someone accepting a significant responsibility, which was exactly how he understood it. The first night after the birth, with Harriet resting in the bedroom and Thomas asleep in the cradle that Harvey had built himself over the preceding 3 months and Eli asleep in his room, Harvey sat on the porch of the house in the October night and looked out at the land and the stars, and Harriet, waking briefly, could see him through the window, this large, quiet man sitting with everything he had built and everything he now had, and she thought, "There is nothing missing." She thought, I walked into a livestock competition as a joke, and I brought home a trophy and a husband and the full weight of the rest of my life, and every single piece of it was the right piece. The years that followed had the quality of things that are genuinely good, not perfect, not without difficulty, but bearing a fundamental rightness through all their seasons. The operation continued to grow, methodically and without urgency, because both Harriet and Harvey were people who believed in building things properly rather than quickly. They added to the herd with careful breeding choices, many of them Harriet's, and Monarch's bloodline became known in the county for its quality, a source of private satisfaction that Harriet did not make a performance of but felt thoroughly. Eli grew into a young man who was everything his parents had recognized in the child, serious and observant and gifted with animals. And at 14, he was doing the work of a full hand, and doing it with a quality that made Clem, who was by then 22 and the ranch's permanent foreman, say to Harvey one day that Eli Wallace was the finest natural stockman he had ever seen, which Harvey told Harriet that evening at supper. And Harriet received this with the compressed fullness in the chest, and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Yes, he is." Thomas grew into a different kind of person than his brother, louder and more immediately sociable, and with a gift for mathematics that neither parent could entirely account for, but that the schoolteacher in Colby Creek said was exceptional. And the household contained all of these different personalities with the spaciousness of a home that had been genuinely built rather than simply assembled. Harvey became, over time, a less private person, not in any wholesale transformation, but in the gradual way that a person who has been cold becomes warm when placed in genuine warmth long enough. He had opinions he now shared at town meetings where before he had been silent. He had friends where before he had had acquaintances. He laughed more easily, a fact noticed by everyone who had known him before and attributed, accurately, to Harriet, who received this attribution without particular comment but with a private satisfaction. They went to the livestock competition every year. They won it together 4 out of the next 5 years in the cattle category, losing 1 year to a rancher from the north part of the county, who brought an absolute specimen of a bull that even Harriet had to admire without reservation. And that year they took second and went to supper at the hotel anyway, and Harvey ordered the apple pie, and they talked about what the blue ribbon bull had done differently and what they could learn from it. And this conversation, this practical and analytical and genuine engagement with both winning and losing, was so characteristic of who they both were that Harriet felt the truth of it like a landmark, like the cottonwood tree, like the streak of silver in her hair. This is who we are, this is what we have built, this is the life. The year Eli turned 18, he asked Harvey if he might enter his own animal in the competition, a bull he had been quietly developing for 2 years that he believed had a strong chance. Harvey said yes with the seriousness the question deserved and spent 2 evenings with Eli going over the entry requirements and the presentation techniques that he had learned from watching Harriet. And on the day of the competition, Eli took second place, losing to his mother's entry by the smallest possible margin. And the look on his face when Harriet took the blue ribbon was equal parts genuine admiration for his mother and the specific competitive fire that he had clearly inherited equally from both sides. Harriet gave him the blue ribbon after the ceremony. He tried to refuse it, and she told him to stop being sentimental and take the ribbon. She had a shelf full of them, and he was just getting started. And the look on his face when he held it was something she kept in a private place alongside the other things she kept there. Harvey saw this exchange from across the ring and came to Harriet as the crowd was dispersing and said nothing, just put his arm around her shoulders and kept it there while they watched Eli show the ribbon to Thomas, who was 5 and interested in everything, and who announced immediately that he intended to win the competition himself when he was old enough, a statement that no one contradicted because it seemed entirely likely. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, Harvey took Harriet out to the porch after supper, after the boys were in bed, with coffee and a piece of the dried apple pie she had made that day, and they sat where they had sat on that first Saturday in May 3 years before, when nothing was yet decided and everything was possible. "Do you remember the coffee beans?" she asked. "I needed a reason to come," he said, with the slight expression that was his version of sheepishness. "You needed a reason," she said. "You could have just come." "I didn't know that yet," he said. "I had only just met you. You had just watched me beat you at a livestock competition," she said. "Monarch beat Titan," he said, with a dignity that she had teased him about for 5 years and that she intended to continue teasing him about indefinitely. "Monarch was my bull," she said. "Your bull," he said. He looked out at the darkening pasture where the cattle were settling for the night, the shapes of them in the dusk, substantial and calm. "You walked into that ring with him and I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" He turned and looked at her with those dark eyes, in the dusk on the porch of the house that was now fully and completely theirs, with the extended kitchen and the 3 rooms and the covered porch that ran the full front length, with the sounds of the ranch settling around them and the boys asleep inside. "I thought," he said, "that whoever this woman is, she knows exactly what she has. And I thought." He paused again, and she waited because she had learned his pauses. "I thought I wanted very badly to be looked at the way she looks at that bull." Harriet was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You have been looked at that way for quite some time." "I know," he said. "I know I have." And the way he said it, the complete and settled knowledge in it, was its own kind of trophy, its own blue ribbon, better than any brass thing on a wooden base, which she had told him once and which he had told her was not true. The trophy was on the shelf in the main room and it was staying there, and she had said, fine, it could stay there. And it did, year after year. First place, cattle category, Colby Creek Livestock Competition, 1882, Harriet Wallace. The life they were living was the one neither of them had exactly planned, and both of them had needed in ways they had not fully understood until they were inside it. And it was large and practical and sometimes difficult and often beautiful. And it was entirely theirs. And it was, by any measure that mattered, exactly what winning looked like. In the spring of 1886, there was a letter from Harvey's sister in Ohio, who they had visited by train the previous winter, suggesting that she might like to bring her own family out to Kansas to see the operation she had heard so much about. Harvey read the letter at the breakfast table and passed it to Harriet without comment, and she read it and looked up, and they had a conversation with their eyes that lasted about 3 seconds and covered everything that needed covering. And then Harvey wrote back and said the guest room would be ready in August, and they looked forward to seeing her. The sister came in August, a warm and direct woman named Eleanor, who had Harvey's eyes and none of his contained reserve, and who looked at Harriet for about 10 minutes after arriving and said, "Thank God," under her breath in a way she clearly intended to be audible, and who spent a week on the property helping with nothing, because she was emphatically not a ranch person, but enthusiastically consuming everything Harriet put on the table and asking questions about Kansas with the genuine curiosity of someone who has heard about something for a long time and is finding it is exactly as good as advertised. Eleanor and Harriet sat on the porch on the last evening of her visit after the men and the boys had gone in, and Eleanor said, "He was so lonely, you know, for so long." "I know," Harriet said. "He wrote me once years ago that he thought maybe the land was enough," Eleanor said. "That maybe that was his life and it was good and it should be enough." Harriet looked at the land in the August evening, her land, their land, the grass and the cattle and the creek line, and the sky that was doing something extraordinary with the sunset, layers of gold and orange and a deep burning red. "The land is enough in the way that good work is enough," Harriet said. "It sustains you. But it doesn't love you back." Eleanor looked at her and then looked at the house behind them where the lights were on, and the sound of Harvey and Eli talking about some fence calculation was audible through the window, and she said, "No, it doesn't. They were quiet for a while in the warm August evening, and then Alina said, "I heard about the livestock competition. Me Perkins wrote the most extraordinary letter to someone who lives near us somehow. The story got all the way to Ohio." Harriet turned to look at her. Me Perkins. Apparently the way she tells it, she practically engineered the whole thing. The laugh that came out of Harriet was genuine and complete, and Alina laughed too, and the sound of them went out into the Kansas evening and up into the burning sky. And inside the house, Harvey heard it and stopped talking about fence calculations and smiled the real smile, the one that came freely now, without reluctance. And Eli looked at his father and his father looked back, and they did not say anything, but Eli nodded once, slowly. The way he nodded when something was correct and settled, and entirely as it should be. The trophy from the 1882 competition stayed on the shelf in the main room of the Brooks Ranch house, for as long as either Harvey or Harriet could remember having a main room to put it in. Through all the years and all the seasons and all the things that followed. Through Thomas winning the competition himself at the age of 17, with a Hereford cross that made even the Abilene judges take notice. Through Eli eventually taking over the northern operation on land Harvey had bought adjacent to their own, and doing things with it that would have made Robert Wallace incredibly proud. And that did make Harriet privately and completely proud every single day, through the birth of a daughter they named Clara, after the neighbor who had altered Harvey's suit for the wedding, in the winter of 1887, who came into the world with the same stubborn set to the jaw as her mother and the same dark, still eyes as her father, and who would turn out to have, as the years revealed, the ranching gift of all three of her siblings combined, and her mother's absolute certainty about where things should be. Through all of it, the trophy sat on the shelf, brass going gradually to a warm patina, the wooden base acquiring the small marks of a household that was full of living. Harriet dusted it on Saturdays the way she dusted everything, practically and without ceremony. But sometimes she would pick it up for a moment, just hold the weight of it, and remember a Tuesday morning in May of 1882 when Me Perkins had said something that was meant to be helpful, and had been, in its own unlikely way, the most useful thing that had happened to Harriet Wallace in years. She had walked into that competition as a joke, or at least as a reaction, which was close enough to the same thing in the moment. She had walked out with the trophy. And then, after supper, with a different kind of prize entirely, one she had not entered for and had not expected and had wanted, she now knew, more than she had known how to want anything at the time. She had walked out with Harvey Brooks, or the beginning of him, which was the same thing. The land outside the window was vast and honest and beautiful and difficult and hers, and the man who owned the other half of it was inside the house doing whatever it was he was doing on this particular evening. And the children who were the best thing either of them had ever built were out in the world doing the things that the children of people like Harriet and Harvey Brooks did, which was to say, seriously, carefully, with full attention, and with more love than they always showed but always had. Harriet put the trophy back on its shelf and went inside, and the door closed behind her against the Kansas night, and inside the house was warm and lit and full of voices, and outside the stars came out one by one over the land until there were too many to count, which was the right number, which was exactly enough.